So devilish a fire. The black women who started the civil rights movement. Civilization must show two things: the glory and beauty of creating life and the need and duty of power and intelligence. This, and this only, will make the perfect marriage of love and work. But what of black women? The world that wills to worship womankind studiously forgets its darker sisters. I most sincerely doubt if any other race of women could have brought its finest up through so devilish a fire. W.E.B. Du Bois. The history of Black America begins with Angela and ends with Yo Mama. Between those two pillars lies all that this country is or ever will be. When discussing the struggle for liberation and freedom, historians often date the campaign commonly known as the Civil Rights Movement from the 1955 death of Emmett Till until the Civil Rights Act of 1965. This overly broad description of the 4-century effort to get free is usually confined to a list of names such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Jackie Robinson, painting a picture as if black people woke up in 1955 and discovered they were oppressed. However, black women's impact in politics, culture, and the collective reimagining of a free black America formed the foundation of the modern civil rights movement. Even though they were doubly disenfranchised and marginalized by society, their impact was inversely proportionate to their social status. They were perhaps society's most underappreciated and discounted population, yet when it came to fighting for equality, they were arguably the most influential group in the country. It would be impossible to fully document black women's contributions to this country, but to understand how black people have not been consumed by the white-hot heat of America's flames, you must first understand the women who have shielded black America from this forever raging inferno. Mary Church Terrell, first. Mary Eliza Church was born in Memphis on September 23, 1863, to two recently emancipated slaves, Robert Reed Church and Louisa Ayres Church. When Mary was 11, her parents sent her to Oberlin, Ohio to attend Oberlin Public School, which also allowed her to escape the yellow fever epidemic that ravaged Memphis in 1878. Meanwhile, Robert spent his time purchasing the devalued property of deceased yellow fever victims and parlaying it into a real estate empire. When Mary returned to Memphis in 1879, the city had transformed. Her father opened restaurants, saloons, and state-of-the-art hotels that profited from the city's segregation laws, even using his immense wealth to open a bank that loaned money to black residents. He transformed Memphis into one of the rare places where segregated facilities for blacks were equal to, and sometimes better than, those that accommodated whites. Robert Church had become the South's only African-American millionaire. First. Meanwhile, Mary's mother, Louisa, had an idea. She opened a posh beauty parlor that catered to Memphis's elite white women. First. When Mary was 17 years old, she graduated from high school and became one of the first black women accepted into Oberlin College. As the first college in America to accept women, Oberlin created a course of study for female students that allowed them to graduate in 2 years. Mary said, nah, choosing the gentleman's path that required 4 years of study, including learning to speak Greek. While there, she formed a tight clique of besties that included Anna Julia Cooper, the fourth black woman in America to earn a PhD, and Ida Gibbs, who co-founded the first YWCA for black women. After graduation, Mary earned her master's degree in education, another first, and began teaching modern languages at the historically black Wilberforce University before moving to Europe to study, becoming fluent in French, German, and Italian. After she returned to the States, Oberlin offered her a job as a registrar, which would have made her the first black woman to hold the position. But Mary wasn't interested in sharing her talent to help white institutions prosper. Instead, she went to teach Latin at the infamous M Street School in Washington, D.C., later renamed Paul Dunbar High. As soon as she got the job, the faculty at M Street set about trying to hook Mary up with one of their fellow teachers, Robert Terrell. It worked. Church eventually married Terrell, resigned her teaching post, and was named superintendent of the school. After her wedding, Terrell briefly considered leaving public life as an activist and educator. She was ready to focus on raising a family and engaging in community social work until one of her longtime friends, Thomas Moss, the postman and owner of People's Grocery in Memphis, was killed by a lynch mob. Terrell immediately joined her homegirl Ida B. Wells in the fight for anti-lynching laws, writing an article titled Lynching from a Negro's Point of View in 1904. Like Wells, Church became a prolific columnist and chronicler of black life, always pushing for gender equality and civil rights. During a trip to the White House, the two pleaded for President Benjamin Harrison to address the lynching epidemic in his State of the Union speech, to no avail. Fortunately, Terrell's mentor convinced her that her talents were too immense for her to leave public life. After all, when your mentor is Frederick Douglass, you do whatever he says. When Terrell was asked to speak at the 1904 International Congress of Women in Berlin, first, she gave the speech in German. Then she delivered it in French. Then she did it again in English. A staunch suffragist, Terrell co-founded the National Association of Colored Women, was a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, and along with Ida B. Wells, was one of the 2 black women listed as founders of the NAACP. She penned numerous op-eds for the most important newspapers, black and white, but did so under the pen name Euphemia Kirk. Terrell often used her platform to share Wells's research to dispel the myth that lynching laws stopped black men from becoming uncontrollable rapists. With one breath, these spokesmen for the South admit that during the war, when the men of that section, generally speaking, were on the battlefield fighting to keep the iron heel of oppression upon the neck of themselves, the dusky bondmen, left behind on the plantations, protected the mothers, daughters, and wives of their masters with a tenderness, a fidelity, and sacredness of trust which the men of no race have ever surpassed, Terrell said in a 1905 speech. With the next breath, they insist that these men and their descendants have changed so radically in sentiment and conduct as to have become sexual degenerates and brutes, unable to control their passion for white women and unwilling to bridle their low desires. If Terrell had dared address the historic fantasy of the sexually insatiable black savage in modern times, they would have undoubtedly accused her of being a critical race theorist. In a lifetime of incredible achievements, perhaps Terrell's most significant contribution to the movement occurred when she was 87 years old. As one of America's most prominent black women, she was named chair and spokesperson of the Coordinating Committee for the Enforcement of the D.C. Anti-Discrimination Laws, a group that pledged to fight segregation in the nation's capital. Before Terrell and her friends met at Thompson's cafeteria on January 27, 1950, researchers at Howard University Law School had informed the committee that the district had outlawed segregation in 1872, but it was never enforced. The manager greeted the party and informed them that they didn't serve coloreds. "Do you mean to tell me that you were not going to serve me?" Terrell asked. When the manager confirmed that they were so racist they didn't even want black people's money, an argument ensued. Terrell and her friends on the committee later returned to the restaurant to gather more information and were kicked out again, so the city filed a suit against the restaurant on their behalf. 3 years later, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously ruled in District of Columbia versus John R. Thompson Company that segregation was indeed against the law in the nation's capital, desegregating the city forever. By being kicked out of the restaurant, Mary Church Terrell kicked open the doors to equality. Mary Ellen Pleasant, undercover billionaire. When abolitionist John Brown was hanged for treason after attempting a violent overthrow of the institution of slavery, there was a signed note in his pocket that read, "The axe is laid at the foot of the tree. When the first blow is struck, there will be more money to help." W.E.P. Army investigators desperately tried to find out who was responsible for aiding the armed insurrection, thinking it was a wealthy Northern abolitionist. They focused on the initials signed on the note, but they were reading them upside down. It turns out the note was written by one of the wealthiest and smartest black women in American history. Mary Ellen Pleasant was born circa 1814, but because her life is surrounded by mystery, no one knows where. Sometimes she claimed to have been born free, sometimes she claimed she was born in slavery and purchased her freedom, while other times she said she was a child of a voodoo priestess from the Caribbean. In any case, she wound up in Nantucket Island as a child, working as an indentured servant for a family of abolitionists. She never received a formal education, but said she studied men and women a good deal, which may be how she married a wealthy Massachusetts business owner of Cuban descent, James Smith. Smith was a complicated figure. Known to be an abusive man, he was also a staunch abolitionist. He died after 4 years of marriage, leaving Mary tens of thousands of dollars to fund her career as a slave stealer on the Underground Railroad. While hanging out with abolitionists on Nantucket, Mary met and married John James Pleasant in 1848. Her new husband worked as a cook on a whaling ship, which enabled them to transport escaped slaves to Nova Scotia's black communities. After the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it too dangerous for Mary to continue her work, Mary and her husband moved to San Francisco just in time for the California Gold Rush, but not before stopping in New Orleans so Mary could take voodoo lessons from the infamous voodoo queen, Mary Laveau. During her Louisiana stay, Mary and her husband arranged for escaped slaves to travel to California. When Mary traveled in San Francisco with a reported $15,000 in gold coins, she took a job as a domestic servant, even though she was worth nearly $500,000 in today's currency. Because the value of gold was at an all-time high, she exchanged her gold for silver, deposited the silver in the bank, and took out the money $1,000 at a time. Passing for white, Mary told the wealthy white men that she knew of a speculator who could loan money at a 10% interest rate. She used her position to eavesdrop on financial advice and, with the help of Thomas Bell, who worked at a local bank, invested in laundries, utility companies, brothels, and a string of boarding houses. Her husband, meanwhile, continued to work at sea during the couple's 30-year marriage. Pleasant was one of the first investors in oil and ended up owning so much land and real estate that California's governor took the oath of office in one of her boarding houses. She used cunning instincts, blackmail, and her exotic looks to control the most powerful men in the city, writing in her unfinished autobiography that she was a girl full of smartness who let books alone and instead focused on learning how to influence people. Because women weren't allowed to bank, she paid Bell handsomely to keep her deposits in his name. By 1875, Bell and Pleasant had made $30 million, nearly $1 billion in today's currency. Although she passed for white in the community at large, she didn't hide her race from her black beneficiaries, explaining that she was the child of a Hawaiian and a full-blooded Louisiana negress. As soon as the 14th Amendment was signed, she officially changed her race to black and began funding civil rights cases. Luckily, she faced little discrimination, partly because she used her connections and relationships to keep extensive records on the wealthy men who patronized her brothels, as well as detailed accounts of their illegitimate children and backroom political dealings. Pleasant reportedly even arranged marriages between wealthy men and young women whom she called her protégés. In San Francisco, Pleasant earned the nickname the Harriot Tubman of California, funding the Underground Railroad and helping self-emancipated slaves to resettle, hiring them at her numerous restaurants, boarding houses, and horse stables. She was known to be a one-woman social agency in California, providing relief for dozens of black families. In 1858, Archie Lee, an enslaved man whose owner had brought him from Mississippi to California, escaped and declared himself free. Although California was a free state, Archie lost because, as a black man, his testimony wasn't allowed in court. Mary paid for his legal fees and housing and worked to change the law that barred African Americans from testifying in court. By the time the case wound up in the Federal Court of Appeals, the law was overturned and Lee was declared a free man. In 1866, Pleasant filed a lawsuit against two companies after streetcar operators refused to let her ride. She withdrew one lawsuit when the Omnibus Railroad Company agreed to allow African Americans on their cars. The second case, Pleasant versus North Beach and Mission Railroad Company, outlawed segregation on San Francisco public transportation forever. Pleasant died in 1904 after most of her resources were depleted by the widow of Thomas Bell, who claimed that Pleasant's money belonged to Bell. She still had her investments and property, but had spent much of her cash helping others. She spent her last years in a 30-room mansion that spanned 6 blocks. Her underground activities were never known to whites until she dictated her autobiography and revealed her secrets, including the greatest one of all. "Before I pass away," she confessed, "I wish to clear the identity of the party who furnished John Brown with most of his money to start the fight at Harper's Ferry and who signed the letter found on him when he was arrested." Mary's hate for inequality and love for her people were the sparks that fueled her life. Here was a colored woman who became one of the shrewdest business minds of the state. She anticipated the development in oil. She was the trusted confidant of many of the California pioneers, and for years was a power in San Francisco affairs, Du Bois said of Pleasant. Yet she held her memories, her hatreds, her deep designs, and throughout a life that was perhaps more than unconventional, she treasured a bitter hatred for slavery. Amazingly, she managed to overcome every hurdle American society placed before her without losing her humanity or compromising her beliefs. See, it's not impossible. Cali Guy House. Check, please. The idea of reparations is not a new idea, nor has it ever been controversial until recently. After the Civil War, legislators, activists, and anyone with common sense attempted various forms of compensation for formerly enslaved African Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau was an acknowledgement of this sentiment, as was the Southern Homestead Act of 1866, which offered free land to ex-slaves. Perhaps the most common proposal to create some form of economic security for ex-slaves was the Freedmen's Pension. Within the African American community, the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty and Pension Association, the MRB-NPA, quickly became the most popular grassroots effort to push the idea of compensation for former slaves. At the organization's first national conference in Nashville on November 28, 1898, the body elected Cali Guy House, a local washerwoman, as its assistant secretary. Although the title might not seem impressive, House used her position to chart the course for the organization's future. She organized meetings in any place where white people weren't around. She visited churches, she contacted lawmakers, she talked to black newspapers, she formed chapters and trained agents in states across the South. Taking inspiration directly from the government's pension structure for Civil War veterans, House created an organization so powerful that legislators were forced to listen to the group's demands. Between 1890 and 1903, 6 bills were introduced in Congress offering a lump sum, followed by monthly payments, to black Americans who had outlasted slavery. But after Southern Democrats regained reputation in the federal legislature, anything that offered economic or political support for black America was dead on arrival. After all, if they couldn't pass a law that made lynching illegal, reparations were a long shot. But they kept trying. In 1915, the association filed a class action lawsuit, Johnson versus McLeod, in federal court for over $68 million, demanding the return of cotton, taxes collected by the Treasury Department between 1862 and 1868. According to the suit, the money was due to former slaves and their ancestors for their unpaid labor. The suit eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which claimed that the Treasury Department had governmental immunity because slavery was constitutional. In 1916, House was indicted for mail fraud on the grounds that she had sent bogus flyers through the mail. According to prosecutors, House had been soliciting donations from ex-slaves by falsely claiming that pensions had been secured for the ex-enslaved. Without evidence that House or any member of the organization had guaranteed or misled anyone to believe they would receive a pension, she was convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to a year in prison. During her trial, prosecutors revealed that intelligence officers from 3 different bureaus, the U.S. Post Office, the Justice Department, and the Pension Bureau, had been tracking House and the MRB-NPA for years. Federal agents estimated that the group had 300,000 members organizing in churches, fraternities, sororities, and poor communities across the country, but some researchers, including historian Mary Friends Berry, believe the government's estimate may be on the low end. For comparison, in 1919, the NAACP had 90,000 members. In less than 20 years, a 36-year-old Tennessee washerwoman had organized the largest black grassroots organization America had ever seen. The National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty and Pension Association would dissolve after House's imprisonment, but the reparations movement that she championed would never die. Ella Baker. Bigger than a hamburger. As a storyteller, I sometimes have to restrain myself from using hyperbole to point out the importance of certain historical events or figures. However, in this particular case, I am not faced with that problem. If one were to make a list of the most famous figures of the civil rights movement, including Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the rest of the names that white people know, one humbly modest statement encapsulates the life of Ella Josephine Baker. She is more important than all of those guys. Born in 1903, in 1930, Ella joined the Young Negroes Cooperative League to promote and teach black economic power. She was protesting Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and fighting the unjust conviction of the Scottsboro Boys before Martin Luther King could even describe his dreams. She was named the NAACP's Director of Branches in 1943, and in 1952, she became the first female president of the New York City chapter. Baker was instrumental in founding every major civil rights organization during the 1950s and 1960s. In 1957, after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, she moved to Atlanta to help form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. It was Baker's management and ideas that formed the framework of the organization's efforts. However, the group's patriarchal leader, Martin Luther King Jr., blocked her from public leadership roles. 3 years later, Baker was growing tired of the sexism of the ministers in the SCLC when she heard about the explosion of small sit-ins popping up across North Carolina. Knowing young people were the key to forming a more democratic movement, she invited students to a meeting at her alma mater, Shaw University. She convinced King to co-sign the invite and use up the SCLC's funds to finance the conference. The audience was filled with 126 delegates from 58 sit-in centers in 12 states who would become known as the faces of the civil rights movement, including future congressman and freedom writer John Lewis, D.C. Mayor Marion Barry, and the infamous Black Power champion Stokely Carmichael. As always, the meeting was dominated by male leaders. But this time, it was Baker's turn to talk. After King spoke about adopting nonviolence and the need for strong leadership, Baker stood up and gave a speech titled, "Bigger Than a Hamburger." She fired the students up by telling them to forget what had just been said and instead to move toward more radical action, explaining that a youth-oriented grassroots movement that was more democratic and leaderless could achieve more than just a few integrated lunch counters. "I can remember her warning against entanglement with adults," civil rights leader Julian Bond explained, "but just to keep our movement pure. That we had started it, we had carried it forward, we could carry it on by ourselves. She didn't say, 'Don't let Martin Luther King tell you what to do,' but you got the real feeling that that's what she meant. You know, he's a good man and so on, but don't let him tell you what to do." Thus began the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, one of the most effective bodies in the freedom struggle. After the meeting, Baker resigned from King's SCLC and became one of SNCC's most trusted advisors. She convinced the new group to form two distinct wings, one using nonviolent direct action and one organizing voting and political strategies. She helped build a partnership with the Congress of Racial Equality, the CORE, and helped coordinate the Freedom Rides. She was a key figure in organizing the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which offered an alternative to the all-white Democratic Party in the state. She accompanied the group that formed the Democratic Party to seat black delegates at its national convention. She rejected the messianic traditional male leadership roles and promoted a participatory democracy. The result of her actions influenced organizers throughout the country, recasting the disparate fights for equality as one unified civil rights movement. In the 1940s, during her time as an NAACP leader, Baker helped organize leadership training sessions for young people interested in community activism. One of her youngest workshop participants would eventually rise to become secretary of her local NAACP chapter. Inspired by Baker, a young woman named Rosa Parks volunteered for a project that required her to sit down on a Montgomery bus and say, "Nah, I'm good." Ella Baker's battle plans were as important as the foot soldiers who stood on the front lines in the fight for equality and civil rights. Yet, because she was a victim of the inequality she fought against, her name is not as well known as those of her contemporaries. Perhaps she would be more famous if she had someone like Ella Baker to champion her cause. Then again, there is only one Ella Baker. Amelia Boynton will be there. Amelia Boynton was everywhere. In 1961, when civil rights advocates began the early push to expand voting rights in Dallas County, Alabama, a number of different strategies were brought to the table. First, they needed to know how many black people in Selma and the surrounding areas had been disenfranchised. Knowing that children might not be suspected of subverting the Jim Crow laws, local activist Amelia Boynton had already organized kids in Dallas County to go door to door, handing out surveys, concluding that of the 15,000 voting-age black residents, just 242 were registered to vote. Because Alabama forced black voters to prove their ability to read and knowledge of the Constitution, activists also needed to educate black residents on how to pass the literacy test required to register. Amelia Boynton had started the charge on that way back in 1935, teaching classes about how to pass the racist test after she became one of the first black folks in the state to do so. Boynton was a trailblazer, and now she was getting key support from the movement. By 1965, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and every major civil rights activist in America were sitting in Amelia Boynton's living room planning to overthrow Jim Crow in Selma, Alabama. Born in 1911, Boynton attended Georgia State Industrial College, now Savannah State University, before transferring to the Tuskegee Institute, where she hung out with George Washington Carver, even naming a son after him, and earned a degree in home economics. As a U.S. Department of Agriculture home demonstration agent, she spent years traveling across rural Alabama teaching blacks about homemaking, nutrition, and navigating rural life. In southern communities like Selma, there is often one community leader who serves the black population's business needs. Some of the more common professions for this community leader include insurance agent, funeral director, or postal employee, but the one thing they usually have in common is that they are a notary public. So when the Ku Klux Klan ran the town's only black notary public out of town, making it impossible to register to vote, Amelia convinced her husband to start an insurance agency, become a notary, and take over the organization the man had started, the Dallas County Voters League, the DCVL. After she and Samuel acquired a building in downtown Selma, the couple held NAACP meetings in their tiny office, fighting the Klan, the state and local governments, and the notoriously racist local sheriff, Jim Clark. And she even fought hand-to-hand. When a well-known racist attacked the Boyntons in their downtown office in 1954, she grabbed a stick and stood right there, demonstrating the ancient African tradition of wishing a motherfucker would. In 1958, a young Howard Law School student was riding the bus to Selma for Christmas break when the bus stopped at a Trailways bus station in Virginia to allow the passengers to eat. Bruce, the law student, posted up at the whites-only counter just like everyone else. When authorities told him to leave, Bruce wouldn't budge. He was arrested and convicted, but he wouldn't stop until his conviction was overturned. His mother called an NAACP lawyer she knew and made that friend promise to fight for her son even if they had to go to the Supreme Court. Those cops had no idea that Bruce Boynton's mother was infamous organizer Amelia Boynton, and that lawyer pal was none other than Thurgood Marshall. The landmark Supreme Court case of Bruce George Washington Carver Boynton versus Virginia overturned segregation on interstate commerce, changing the course of history forever. Shortly thereafter, young activist Ralph Abernathy, Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis, and others gained prominence on the Freedom Rides, a joint effort by CORE and the SNCC to enforce Boynton versus Virginia. By 1964, Amelia had given up her leadership position in the DCVL to run for Congress, making her the first black woman in the state of Alabama to run for Congress and the first woman of any race to run as a Democrat. After she lost, she didn't stop fighting for justice. She became even more deeply invested in the cause after Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old black deacon, was beaten, shot, and killed by Alabama state troopers during a peaceful protest on February 18, 1965. Boynton rejoined the DCVL and invited the most prominent civil rights leaders of the time to the tiny town of Selma. While many of the League's members were dubious that any of them would show up, Amelia was there in her living room with Martin Luther King and James Bevel, along with the organizers from the SCLC and SNCC, planning how to defeat segregation. There, they organized a march to the state capitol in Montgomery to talk to Governor George Wallace about Jackson's death, but of course Wallace dispatched his club-toting troopers to the march that became known as Bloody Sunday. When officers cracked John Lewis's skull on the Edmund Pettus Bridge during the demonstration, Amelia did not run. The viral picture of the protest was a photo of Amelia Boynton being gassed and beaten by police officers. That was one of the photos that turned public sentiment and convinced President Lyndon Johnson to sign the Voting Rights Act. One of the coolest stories about Amelia Boynton's life was discovered only recently. For years, historians believed Cujo Lewis, who was immortalized in writer Zora Neale Hurston's posthumous bestseller Barracoon, was the last living survivor of the slave trade. In 1860, Timothy Mayer, a wealthy Mobile, Alabama plantation owner, made a bet with his friends that he could sneak a shipment of slaves into the country. 52 years after the importation of human chattel was outlawed in the United States, the Clotilda, a two-masted schooner, snuck into Mobile Bay, returning from a secret mission in Benin, Africa. Captained by William Foster, the Clotilda unloaded its precious cargo, around 112 kidnapped human beings. To hide their misdeeds, Foster rushed to the Clotilda and set it on fire. The vessel sank to the bottom. The stolen Africans were eventually sold and worked as slaves until they were emancipated in 1865. When they were denied reparations, Lewis and a group of slaves put their money together and founded the African-centered town of Africatown, located a few miles from Mobile. In 2019, a British researcher discovered archival footage of a Redoshi, a formerly enslaved woman who was sold to forced labor camp owner Washington Smith in Dallas County, Alabama. Redoshi lived 2 years longer than Cujo Lewis and was even active during the infancy of the civil rights movement. And the story of how that archival footage emerged? One day, a USDA agent named Amelia Boynton visited Radashi on her rural farm and began listening to the stories of her capture, enslavement, and emancipation. Excited, Boynton convinced the Department of Agriculture to bring a film crew out to Aunt Sally's farm and interview her about her experiences. Thus, Amelia Boynton's influence spans from the transatlantic slave trade to this very moment. Amelia Boynton was always there. She still is. The woman who desegregated Montgomery buses. Claudette Colvin was mad. On March 2, 1955, the outspoken 15-year-old high school student stepped onto a Montgomery City bus. Because Colvin's family didn't own a car, she took the Capitol Heights bus home from school every day. She was already sitting in the colored section when the driver, Robert Clare, demanded that she and 3 friends give their seats to white women who were standing up. Colvin thought about the paper on the unfair practices of segregation that she had just turned in to her teacher. She thought about how she couldn't even try on clothes at local department stores lest she sully the items with her black skin. But most of all, she thought about her friend Jeremiah. Jeremiah Reeves was so good-looking and cool, all the girls at Booker T. Washington High School had a crush on him. He played in the school's jazz band, and he already had a job delivering groceries to white neighborhoods. In 1952, the white residents in one Montgomery neighborhood confirmed their suspicions that Reeves was having an affair with a white woman when they peeked in a window and saw the couple undressing. The woman, however, claimed that Reeves was raping her. Police arrested Reeves, took him to a nearby prison, and strapped him into the electric chair for 2 days until he finally confessed. Because Montgomery's black citizens were not allowed to vote, an all-white jury sentenced Reeves to death. This is what radicalized Claudette Colvin. When police officers dragged her off the bus and took her to jail, she had already joined the NAACP's Youth Council. As the cops made jokes about her bra size and body parts, Colvin screamed about her constitutional rights. She felt the echoes of injustice and the touch of her ancestors. History kept me stuck to my seat, Colvin would later say. I felt the hand of Harriet Tubman pausing down on one shoulder and Sojourner Truth pushing down on the other. Aurelia Broder would be next. A widower with 6 children, Broder didn't complete her high school education until she was in her 30s. She later enrolled at Alabama State University, where she met Joanne Gibson Robinson, a professor in the English department. Robinson inspired Broder to get involved in the civil rights movement, and on April 19, 1955, Broder was arrested for sitting in the white section of a Montgomery bus. She would later graduate from Alabama State with honors, earning a bachelor's degree in science. Susan McDonald, known around Montgomery as Miss Sue, owned a pavilion in the city where black residents could gather without fear of racial intimidation. When Miss Sue was arrested for violating Montgomery's bus rules on October 21, 1955, she was in her 70s and could pass for white. McDonald, however, had made sure to inform the driver that she was indeed a black woman before she sat down. That same day, 18-year-old Mary Louise Smith was arrested for sitting in the whites-only section. Janetta Reese was arrested for the same offense. Finally, on Thursday, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks did it too. Unlike Colvin, Broder, McDonald, Smith, and Reese, Parks planned her protest. She served as the secretary for the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and had participated in civil rights activism for more than a decade. Part of the reason Rosa was selected to publicize the injustice of segregation was because of her presentation. The leaders had already rejected Claudette Colvin because she was dark-skinned and outspoken and was pregnant and unmarried. Parks, on the other hand, was fair-skinned, reserved, and had good hair. When Professor Robinson heard about Parks' arrest, she was fed up. After her prize student Broder had been arrested for the same thing, Robinson tried to convince her organization, the Women's Political Council, to organize a citywide bus boycott. Robinson called a few students and colleagues at Alabama State, and they printed 35,000 flyers calling for a one-day citywide boycott and passed them out at local churches. Another woman has been arrested and thrown in jail because she refused to get up out of her seat on the bus for a white person to sit down, read the typewritten flyer. It is the second time since the Claudette Colvin case that a Negro woman has been arrested for the same thing. This has to be stopped. Negroes have rights too, for if Negroes did not ride the buses, they could not operate. 3/4 of the riders are Negro, yet we are arrested or have to stand over empty seats. If we do not do something to stop these arrests, they will continue. The next time it may be you, or your daughter, or mother. This woman's case will come up on Monday. We are therefore asking every Negro to stay off the buses Monday in protest of the arrest and trial. Don't ride the buses to work, to town, to school, or anywhere on Monday. You can afford to stay out of school for one day if you have no other way to go except by bus. You can also afford to stay out of town for one day. If you work, take a cab or walk. But please, children and grown-ups, don't ride the bus at all on Monday. Please stay off all buses Monday. On December 5, 1955, a group of leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA, and asked Robinson to lead it. Robinson declined because of her job at Alabama State, so the next logical choice was E.D. Nixon. A thorn in white Montgomery's side, Nixon had been organizing civil rights campaigns as early as 1940 and was the unelected mayor of Black Montgomery. Because the early civil rights movement was entrenched in sexism, Nixon and others wouldn't even consider a woman leader. Rosa Parks wasn't even allowed to speak at the meeting. Nixon suggested a younger face for the movement, nominating the new pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Unlike the women who had stood up for their rights, King was reluctant. He wanted a more low-key position that would not upset the city's leadership, but after Nixon threatened to expose him as a coward, King accepted the role with a few conditions. As the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association, King did not demand that the city integrate buses. The MIA called for a first-come, first-served seating, more African-American drivers on predominantly black routes, and courteous treatment of black residents. NAACP attorney Fred Gray decided to get involved. He tracked down Colvin, Croder, McDonald, Reese, and Smith to file a civil rights lawsuit against the city. Reese eventually dropped out of the lawsuit because she was being harassed by whites in Montgomery, but Claudette, Aurelia, Miss Sue, and Mary were down. Gray won the case in U.S. District Court, but the city appealed to the Supreme Court. On December 17, 1956, the Supreme Court rejected the city's appeals, affirming the district court's ruling in Aurelia S. Broder et al. Versus W.A. Gale et al. Segregation was unconstitutional on Montgomery city transportation, and on December 20, 1956, the Montgomery bus boycott ended. Mary McLeod Bethune, military genius. Not far from the plantation where my ancestors were enslaved in Sumter and Lee counties sits a Maysville, South Carolina rice and cotton farm where Mary Jane McLeod was born. Everyone knows that Mary McLeod Bethune would eventually take $1.50 and create the Daytona Literary and Industrial Training School for Negro Girls, a historically black institution that later became Bethune-Cookman University. After becoming the first black woman to serve as a college president, she co-founded the United Negro College Fund, which has provided scholarships to more than 500,000 black students. During this time, she forged a friendship with President Franklin Roosevelt's wife and used her status as Eleanor Roosevelt's closest friend in her age group to push the president on his civil rights agenda. Let's be clear, regardless of whether he did it for political expediency or his own white supremacist leanings, Frankie D was a racist. He refused to support anti-lynching legislation. He nominated a Klansman to the Supreme Court. He interned American citizens in concentration camps. And when he introduced his New Deal that made it rain billions on white America to lift the country out of the Great Depression, he largely excluded black citizens. But behind the scenes, Bethune was one of the few people who could speak to Franklin in the African-American dialect known as keeping it real, successfully using her influence with the First Lady to push for economic and political progress for Black America. Because he rarely came in contact with people of the Negro persuasion, Roosevelt thought Bethune was one of the smartest women who ever lived. As the director of the Division of Negro Affairs of the National Youth Administration, she convinced the president to set aside 300,000 public works jobs for African Americans. In 1936, Roosevelt tapped Bethune to organize the Federal Council of Negro Affairs. Known as the Black Cabinet, the group of scholars, activists, and leaders wasn't an official government-sanctioned entity. They took no notes and usually gathered in Bethune's apartment or her office as a back channel on policy for Black America. One of the group's first orders of business was to discuss recent union protests led by union organizer Asa Philip Randolph, who was demanding an end to discrimination in defense industries. Because he was a socialist and a radical, Randolph wasn't a member of the Black Cabinet, but the Brain Trust knew the power and influence he wielded among the black working class. The president was kind of preoccupied with this little thing called World War II, so he dismissed Randolph's threats of a large-scale protest in Washington until Bethune said, "Hey, trust me, you won't listen to old boy." Roosevelt put the black cabinet in charge of addressing the issue. Rayford Logan, a member of the council and a history professor from Howard University, drafted Executive Order 8802 declaring that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in the defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. The order also established the Fair Employment Practice Committee to enforce equality in the defense industry. With such a momentous victory under her belt, one would assume Bethune would leave well enough alone. But more can be done, she wrote in a letter to Roosevelt on November 27, 1939. One of the sorest points among Negroes which I have encountered is the flagrant discrimination against Negroes in all the armed forces of the United States. Forthright action on your part to lessen discrimination and segregation, and particularly in affording opportunities for the training of Negro pilots for the Air Corps, would gain tremendous goodwill, perhaps even out of proportion to the significance of such action. Bethune didn't just make the suggestion that Roosevelt introduce black pilots to the Army's newly created Air Force, she laid out a plan on how to get it done without ruffling feathers. Among the Army's top brass, black pilots flying airplanes was a ludicrous idea. There hadn't been an African-American pilot in the history of the U.S. Armed Forces, and if you thought white people hated seeing uniformed blacks being treated as heroes after World War I, can you imagine how furious they would be about black pilots flying the most sophisticated aircraft in the world? Commanding General Henry Hap Arnold was in dire need of pilots, but admitted that a crew of African-American airmen would result in Negro officers serving over white enlisted men, creating an impossible social situation. To quell the controversy, Arnold commissioned a report that concluded that because of Roosevelt's executive order, the Army couldn't turn away qualified black pilots. However, there were only 124 African-American pilots in the entire country, and since the Army was segregated, there was no place to train them and no funds to build an entirely new training facility. Black leaders felt betrayed. The July 1940 cover of The Crisis explained the controversy perfectly. Warplanes. Negro Americans may not build them, repair them, or fly them, but they must help pay for them. Bethune, however, was fine about the Army's decision, because she had already found a solution to this inequity. Unbeknownst to most of America, Bethune had privately convinced the White House to tack a benign provision, Public Law 18, onto a military appropriations bill intended to prepare the nation's armed forces for war. The addendum included funds for black colleges and required the establishment of the Civilian Pilot Training Program, the CPTP, a non-military aviation program that found qualified civilians and trained them as pilots. Because the civilian pilot training program wasn't technically part of the military, the historically black colleges had been sending prospective pilots to train at the Tuskegee Institute, which used funds from Public Law 18 to recruit, test, and train black pilots using the exact same methods employed at nearby Maxwell Field in Montgomery. Still, they needed a platform to prove they were as good as the white boys, and naturally, Bethune had a literal ace up her sleeve. On March 29, 1941, Eleanor arrived in Tuskegee to attend a trustee meeting for the Rosenwald Fund, a charity that donated millions to black educational institutions, including Bethune-Cookman College. After her morning meetings, the First Lady took a day trip to Tuskegee's flight training site, where she met C. Alfred Chief Anderson, a black pilot. Ignoring the protest of her Secret Service officers, Eleanor asked Anderson to take her on a short flight. 40 minutes later, the First Lady told Anderson, "Well, you can fly all right." 4 months later, on July 19, 1941, the Army welcomed Class 42C, the U.S. military's first all-black class to train as combat pilots. Even though Tuskegee had identified, trained, and qualified the black civilian pilots for flight school, the Army still resisted. Citing the military segregation policy, the top brass still insisted there was no place to complete their military training. But this is where Bethune's seemingly innocuous plan came together. Remember Eleanor's meeting for the Rosenwald Fund? After her flight, the First Lady arranged for a loan to build Moton Field in Tuskegee, where the soldiers could complete their first phase of training. And because Randolph's Executive Order 8802 forbade discrimination in awarding defense contracts, black-owned construction firm McKissack & McKissack won the contract to build a state-of-the-art training facility. Using a design by African-American architect Hilliard Robinson, labor from 2,000 of those black public works employees that Bethune had lobbied for, and the funds from Public Law 18, McKissick and McKissick completed Tuskegee Army Airfield in just 6 months, making it the only Army site that hosted 3 phases of pilot training, basic, advanced, and transition, at a single location. On July 11, 1943, German and Italian troops surrendered the Mediterranean island of Pantelleria. In the entire military history of the world, a land force had never been defeated by an air-only assault until the very first mission of the 99th Pursuit Squadron of the U.S. Army Air Force, or, as we call them, the Tuskegee Airmen. Mary McLeod Bethune's legacy extended into every section of black life in politics, education, economics, and social life, and all it took was wisdom, courage, intelligence, and a measly $1.50. Unit Review. 3 little questions. Number 1. How did black women contribute to the civil rights movement? A. They started it. B. They only provided the strategy, tactics, legwork, vision, and manpower. C. According to census data, the vast majority of black activists were birthed by black women. Or D. By being black women. Number 2. Who was more famous during her lifetime? A. Ida B. Wells. B. Harriet Tubman. C. Mary McLeod Bethune. Or D. Lisa Angela Pamela Renee Ty. Number 3. Which one of these benefited from the work of black women? A. Universal white male suffrage. B. Universal white female suffrage. C. Black male suffrage. Or D. All of the above. Supplement. Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the queer black woman who invented rock and roll. It is as simple as this. What we know as rock and roll did not exist before Sister Rosetta Tharpe. She came before Elvis and Johnny Cash. She preceded Chuck Berry and Little Richard. When most music historians are asked who invented this class of music, many will name one of the previously mentioned rock stars. The most respectful and thoughtful will say it was a combination of these men. But every single one of those men, including Little Richard, will tell you that the first person from whom they heard the sound with which we have become familiar was Rosetta Tharpe. In his induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Johnny Cash said that she was his favorite singer growing up. Little Richard called her his greatest influence. Chuck Berry said that his entire career was just one long Rosetta Tharpe impersonation. A PBS documentary on her life called her the godmother of rock and roll. She is still called the forgotten mother of the genre and the most influential artist ever. In 1963, a collection of black musicians traveled around the world with the Blues and Gospel Tour. The bill featured artists such as Sonny Terry and Brownie McGhee, Cousin Joe, Otis Spann, and Muddy Waters, all household names in America but relative unknowns in Europe. In fact, the only venue in the United Kingdom that booked the tour was in Manchester. As their train arrived in Manchester, one of the artists, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, asked the promoter if she could change her opening number to the gospel classic, Didn't It Rain? When she strapped on the guitar and played her unique mix of blues and gospel, it blew the audience's mind and influenced musicians in the area for decades, especially a group who traveled from London in a small bus together. Some dude named Eric Clapton, a kid named Jimmy Page, and the members of a very obscure garage band called the Rolling Stones. Maybe she is overlooked because she was technically a gospel singer, because rock didn't exist yet, remember? Perhaps Tharpe's blackness has something to do with the fact that she wasn't elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame until 2017. Or her queerness. Or the fact that she was a woman. Music authorities argue about a handful of songs recorded between 1946 and 1952 when discussing what might be the first rock and roll song ever, the most popular of which is Rocket 88 by Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats, recorded in 1951. Music authorities be lying. It is all Rosetta. Rosetta Newman was born in 1915 in Cotton Plant, Arkansas. By the time she was 6 years old, she was performing in churches around the South with her mother. At that same age, she and her mother moved to Chicago. In 1934, she married a Church of God in Christ preacher named Thomas Tharpe after she became a renowned gospel musician in the Colgate community. Rosetta would divorce her husband after a few years, but she kept the surname as her stage moniker. During a time when the idea of a guitar-playing woman was non-existent, not only did Rosetta Tharpe erase this line by mastering the symbol of musical masculinity, but her blend of gospel and secular music was seen as earth-shattering. Her willingness to play God's music in the devil's den of nightclubs and music halls caused an uproar. She was one of the first artists to use heavy distortion on her electric guitar long before the blues artists tried it. After a move to New York, Tharpe began playing with some of the biggest bands in the country, including Duke Ellington's. By the time she was 23, she had a recording contract and recorded Decca Records' first gospel songs. In October 1938, when Elvis was 3 years old, when Chuck Berry was 12, when Little Richard was 6 years old, and when Jackie Brinston and his Delta Cats were still kittens, Sister Rosetta Tharpe recorded This Train, a gospel song that would become a mainstream hit. But the other side of the record featured Tharpe playing an electric guitar in a wailing blues-inspired tempo that no one had ever heard before. The song was called Rock Me. Tharpe's 1945 hit Strange Things Happening Every Day was the first gospel record to cross over to the Billboard race record chart, eventually reaching number 2. Strange Things poked fun at religion and opened with a riff that would typify guitar solos a decade later. It became a favorite of Memphis DJ Dewey Phillips and his protege, a little-known white dude named Elvis something. The recording is now referred to as a rock and roll record and has been covered by Bruce Springsteen. Even though she was playing venues like Carnegie Hall and the Cotton Club with legendary acts such as Cab Calloway, Tharpe longed to get back to the gospel music circuit. After meeting gospel singer Mary Knight in 1946, Tharpe entered into a relationship with her, and they lived openly as a queer couple until it ended in 1951. And this was major, as Sister Rosetta Tharpe was not an unknown, hidden little secret. She was such a huge star that she had her third wedding in a stadium where 25,000 people attended. Yet with the move to folk music and the British invasion that rejuvenated musicians of her era in the 1960s and 70s, Tharpe didn't get the same bump that male blues musicians did because she continued to stick to gospel-themed music. She died on October 9, 1973, after suffering a second stroke. Rock and roll did not exist before Rosetta Tharpe, but to say she invented it may be a little presumptuous. Yet she was somehow erased from the history of music. Most reasonable music historians will tell you that one person shouldn't receive credit for an entire genre. And while it is true that not every single musician who ever played rock and roll was inspired by Rosetta Tharpe, it is also true that there is not a single rock musician playing in the current era doing something that Rosetta Tharpe wasn't doing 80 years ago. She did it first. Just for the sake of clarity, let's see how Merriam-Webster defines invent. Invent, to produce. Something, such as a useful device or process, for the first time through the use of the imagination or of ingenious thinking and experiment. Well, I guess that settles that.